The first frost of March had settled over the remote Bavarian farm, clinging stubbornly to the wooden beams of the Gruber homestead. Andreas Gruber, a stocky man in his 60s, rose before dawn every morning to tend to the animals, the cold biting his fingers despite thick wool gloves. His wife, Cecilia, moved silently in the shadows of the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the family's modest household. Victoria, their adult daughter, tended to the young children with a nervous vigilance, glancing toward the surrounding woods more often than any normal farmer would. From the first week of March, strange events began. Cecilia noticed small footprints in the fresh snow outside the back door, far too large for a child, but oddly distorted, almost as if the snow itself had been pressed down by something unnatural. Doors would creak open on their own, even when Andreas swore he had bolted them. Livestock began acting strangely, cows refusing to enter the barn, chickens huddling together as though sensing a predator. The family whispered nervously, but the isolation of Hinterkaifeck meant help was miles away, and even the village dared not approach too closely, warning that something was not right on the farm. One morning, Andreas found the keys to the house missing, only to discover them later hanging on a nail in a corner of the barn, coated in frost as though they had been left there for weeks. Victoria's children began to whisper of the man in the woods, a figure they claimed watched them from the shadows, pale as death, eyes glowing faintly in the dim sunlight. The adults tried to laugh it off, but unease began to take root. The forest surrounding the farm seemed alive, shifting unnaturally in the windless hours, sending a subtle, omnipresent tension through the household. By mid-March, the family's paranoia deepened. Andreas began to sleep with the mattock at his side, listening to each creak of the house, every groan of the wood settling in the cold. At night, faint footsteps echoed above the kitchen, sometimes descending slowly to the rooms below, though no one was ever found. Doors would slam shut suddenly, and the smell of smoke would fill rooms where no fire burned. Even the children began waking in terror, speaking of whispers that floated through the house, cold fingers brushing their faces as they huddled beneath their blankets. The days blurred together as tension mounted. Andreas began keeping a written log of strange occurrences. Objects moved inexplicably, livestock found dead with no visible wounds, the sense of being watched intensifying. Victoria confided to her mother that she saw shadows darting between the trees at the edge of the property at night, vanishing when approached. The villagers murmured of curses, warning that Hinterkaifeck had long been a place of bad fortune, a thin veil between the natural world and something darker. It was during this period that the stalker, though no one knew who he was yet, became more daring. He would leave signs of his presence, footprints in the snow leading toward the house, a discarded piece of clothing that smelled faintly of iron and decay, sometimes a rough, indistinct carving in the wooden fence post. Observers described him as gaunt, unnaturally tall, with eyes that seemed hollow and all-seeing. Locals later claimed he moved like a shadow, silent and purposeful, as though guided by something beyond human comprehension. Some whispered he was possessed, a vessel for an evil that had long haunted the forest around. Paranoia reached a fever pitch. He reinforced doors, checked the barn repeatedly, and even built crude traps for intruders, but the strange disturbances persisted. A sense of malevolence seemed to press against the walls themselves, cold and tangible, making breathing difficult in the enclosed rooms. At night, the family huddled together, listening to the faint echo of footsteps overhead, whispering voices, and the creaking of the wooden floors where no one walked. As March drew to an end, the stalker's presence became undeniable. Cecilia awoke one night to find the barn door open, snow drifting across the threshold, despite her locking it before bedtime. The livestock were agitated, moaning and stamping their feet. Victoria noticed that small items in the house, keys, utensils, a child's toy, had been moved from their usual places, sometimes piled neatly in corners, sometimes scattered chaotically, as though someone or something was studying the family, learning their routines. The children, too young to fully articulate their fear, clutched their mother at night, whispering of a man who comes from the shadows and the strange way he did not seem to walk but float. Andreas, increasingly obsessed, began to patrol the property late at night, mattock in hand, eyes straining for movement in the thick blackness. On one occasion, he claimed to see a shadowy figure pause at the edge of the forest, a shape too tall, too thin, and completely still, staring at the farmhouse. When he called out, it vanished, leaving only the unnatural cold that seemed to seep into his bones. The morning was quiet, deceptively so. Snow had fallen overnight, muffling the world in a soft white silence. The stalker arrived as he had planned, moving with a patient, terrifying precision. He carried a mattock and a lantern, its flickering light casting grotesque shadows across the snow-covered ground. Entering through a side door left carelessly unlatched, he began his work. Andreas was struck first, the mattock raised with deliberate strength. The impact was brutal, immediate, and merciless. He fell near the stove, the warmth of the kitchen offering no comfort against the cold, sharp pain of the blows. Giselia tried to flee, only to be intercepted, her struggle brief and silent. Victoria attempted to protect the children, but one by one, the family succumbed to the horrifying efficiency of the attack. Even the youngest, Joseph, was carried into the barn, the air thick with snow-dusted cold and silenced. By dawn, Hinterkaifeck was empty, its silence absolute, yet haunted. When authorities discovered the crime days later, they found the house intact, meals left on the table, a low fire burning, animals alive in the barn. No valuables were stolen. Footprints around the farm were confounding, some human, some grotesquely misshapen, as if something beyond human had moved across the snow. Investigators could not solve the crime. Over decades, stories grew. Visitors sensed unseen eyes, footsteps in empty rooms, whispers in the cold night air. Paranormal researchers noted orbs, shadowy figures, and inexplicable cold spots. Some claim the souls of the Grubers roamed the property, trapped in a space between life and death. Others believe the stalker's spirit, or whatever possessed him, still walks the snow-dusted paths, patient and eternal, waiting for the next trespasser to step too close. The final week before the massacre brought an unrelenting tension that seemed to seep into every creaking beam of the farmhouse. Each morning, Andreas awoke to the unnatural stillness of the forest, the trees coated in frost that glinted eerily in the weak sunlight. The birds had vanished. No crows, no sparrows, no fluttering wings disturbed the silence. Even the livestock sensed it. The cows pressed against the corners of the barn, low moans rumbling in their throats. The chickens huddled in tight, nervous clusters, feathers bristling at unseen threats. Giselia, once practical and strong, now moved like a ghost through her own home, her eyes darting the shadows and dark corners. At night, she heard faint whispering in the walls, indistinct but suffused with malice, as if the house itself had become a sentient entity, observing, judging, waiting. Victoria's children were barely sleeping, nightmares etched on their small faces, muttering in hushed tones about the man who walks but makes no sound. And he is behind the trees watching. The adults exchanged anxious glances but spoke little. Admitting fear would somehow make it more real, and none of them wanted to acknowledge what they were all beginning to sense. Something terrible was coming. Neighbors reported seeing a pale figure in the woods at dusk, moving unnaturally, no sway of the body, no footprints in the fresh snow leading toward or away, only the faint impression that the figure had been there, and then, nothing. Some villagers murmured that the farm itself was cursed, that its soil, steeped in centuries of labor and death, had become a conduit for something ancient, malevolent, waiting to be fed. Andreas had begun leaving knives by the doors, locking the barn at night. But no matter how careful he was, the feeling of being watched only grew. The last night began quietly, the snow falling in soft layers, muffling every sound of the forest and the surrounding fields. Within the house, the family moved about their evening chores, unaware that the shadow stalking them had crept silently through the cold, dense woods. The man or the force controlling him carried a mattock, its head sharpened not for farming but for violence. He had observed the Grubers for weeks, learning their routines, noting when doors were most vulnerable, when the family was most vulnerable, when the children slept and the adults relaxed. He entered the house without a sound. Anneliese was the first to feel the sudden unnatural presence, a cold that had nothing to do with the snow outside. Before he could react, the mattock came down, striking with the precision of someone who had trained their entire life for this moment. Blow after blow fell upon him, the impact hollow yet thunderous in the wooden kitchen, until he slumped lifelessly near the stove. Cecilia, hearing the thud, tried to flee to the kitchen door, but he intercepted her. The struggle was brief. Victoria rushed to shield her children, but the attacker's strength was inhuman, his movements deliberate and terrifyingly calm. One by one, the family was extinguished, their bodies strewn across the house in positions that mirrored the disturbances they had experienced in the preceding weeks. Overturned chairs, scattered utensils, the echo of panic frozen in time. Even the youngest, Joseph, barely 2 years old, was carried to the barn and silenced with the same grim efficiency. By dawn, Hinterkaifeck was silent, the snow outside unbroken except for the distorted footprints that hinted at a horror beyond human comprehension. When neighbors finally approached the farm days later, drawn by the absence of the family and the growl of curiosity, they were met with a scene so grotesque it could scarcely be described. Inside, meals remained untouched, a faint fire still smoldered in the stove, and the livestock wandered in the barn, oblivious to the carnage that had taken place. No valuables had been stolen. There was no sign of robbery or revenge. Footprints in the snow were both human and bizarrely misshapen, some too long, some twisted in ways that defied logic, as though the land itself had been pressed by an unnatural weight. Investigators were baffled. The killings were brutal and methodical, yet motive was absent. Each strike seemed purposeful, almost ritualistic. Some hypothesized a deranged local. Others whispered of possession or supernatural influence, a force guiding the killer to the farm to fulfill some dark intent. Despite exhaustive investigation, no culprit was identified, and the mystery of Hinterkaifeck became a permanent fixture in Bavarian lore, a haunting case where historical fact collided with an almost mythic evil. Over the decades, the farm remained a locus of fear. Visitors reported footsteps in empty rooms, doors that opened and closed on their own, faint whispers that seemed to speak in the voices of the murdered family. Paranormal researchers recorded inexplicable cold spots, fleeting shadows, orbs of light hovering near the barn, and recordings of disembodied voices muttering in German. People walking the property at night spoke of feeling watched, an oppressive presence pressing upon them like the very air had grown heavy and sentient. Locals claimed the spirits of the Grubers linger, trapped in a liminal space between life and death, their unfinished business with the stalker, or whatever possessed him, binding them to the site. Some believe the man's spirit, corrupted and bound to the farm by his own violent acts, still roams the woods, patient and eternal, observing any who venture too close. To this day, Hinterkaifeck is more than a site of unsolved murders. It is a testament to the enduring presence of evil. The events of March 31st, 1922, serve as a grim reminder that some forces are beyond human understanding, forces that can twist reality, warp perception, and leave a mark on the land itself. Snow may fall, the wind may howl, and the forest may sway, but inside the house, the whispers continue, the footsteps echo, and the faint scrape of a mattock reminds all who pass that some evils do not die, they wait. Andreas Gruber awoke each morning before the sun crested the tree line, the cold of March sinking into his bones despite his thick wool coat. The forest seemed heavier now, darker, as though the trees themselves pressed down on the small farmstead. Every sound, the low moan of the wind, the snapping of a distant branch set his nerves on edge. He noticed footprints in the snow outside the barn door, oddly misshapen, not quite human, though no one else had come to the farm. Each day he patrolled the perimeter, mattock in hand, listening for the subtle crunch of snow beneath a stranger's boots. Inside the house, Andreas felt a presence that went beyond rational explanation. Doors would creak open without cause, and a chill would rise from the floorboards like frost spreading over skin. At night, he thought he saw movement above the kitchen ceiling, shadows darting across the attic. The family tried to dismiss these occurrences, but Andreas' fear deepened. He left no stone unturned, latching doors, inspecting windows, arranging furniture so that he would notice the slightest disturbance. Yet, each precaution seemed futile, as if the darkness had already taken root, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Cecilia moved through the house with a quiet dread. She had spent decades managing the farm and raising children, but in these final days, every shadow seemed to leer at her. Every gust of wind through the cracks of the cabin a whisper of threat. At night, she would awaken to faint footsteps in the hall, a soft scraping of the floor, and a low, inhuman breathing she could not identify. Victoria's children clutched her arms, murmuring of a man in the trees, and she had no answer, no comfort. Only the suffocating sense that the forest around Hinterkaifeck had become sentient. She began to dream of the stalker, tall, pale, hollow-eyed, standing outside in the snow, watching, never moving, waiting. Sometimes she would wake to find her belongings shifted, the chairs slightly overturned, a strange chill on her hands where she touched the cold wooden furniture. She whispered to Andreas about her fears, but he remained grimly silent, both of them trapped in a spiral of dread that neither could fully articulate. Victoria tried to shield her children from the sense of impending doom, but the small house seemed to amplify fear, turning creaks into footfalls, shadows into monstrous figures. Cecilia, her daughter, barely 7, would awaken crying, pointing to corners of the room where no one stood, muttering of him who watches in silence. Joseph, 2 years old, could not articulate his terror, but would shiver violently at the mention of the woods. Victoria slept fitfully, dreams invaded by grotesque figures and distorted voices whispering warnings she could not understand. The children were drawn to windows, gazing at the forest beyond, mesmerized and frightened by a figure that occasionally appeared between the trees. Tall, gaunt, and unmoving, eyes hollow and fixed on the farm. Sometimes it seemed to vanish entirely, leaving only the oppressive cold, as if its very presence warped reality. The man who approached Hinterkaifeck was no ordinary killer. Locals later described him as pale, unnaturally still, with eyes hollow yet piercing. Those who would see him fleetingly reported a sense that he was not entirely human, that some force had taken control of his mind and body. For weeks, he observed the family, learning their habits, noting when doors were left unsecured, when the children slept, and when Andreas would leave the house to tend the animals. His approach was calculated and deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if guided by a presence beyond comprehension. He carried the mattock, a simple farming tool, but in his hands it became an instrument of fate. Every movement was deliberate, silent, and unrelenting. He seemed to glide across the snow, leaving footprints that distorted unnaturally, some too long, some twisted, as though the very fabric of the earth had been pressed down by something not of this world. Villagers who glimpsed him at a distance later swore his gaze seemed to pierce their souls, as if he could see not only them but their fears, their hidden thoughts, their own inevitable deaths. The stalker entered the house with terrifying precision. Andreas was struck first. the mattock swinging in a rhythm so deliberate it resembled a grim dance of death. The first blow lifted him off his feet, the second and third ensuring he would never rise again. Cecilia attempted to flee, but his grip was impossibly strong. Her screams echoed briefly in the wooden halls before being silenced, a harsh final whisper swallowed by the shadows. Victoria tried to shield her children, lifting them towards safety, but the force that had overtaken the killer allowed him to move with impossible strength and speed. Blow after blow fell upon the family, each strike precise, almost methodical, each one leaving the house in disarray, a grotesque reflection of the disturbances they had endured in the preceding weeks. Chairs were overturned, utensils scattered, furniture shifted. Every act of violence mirrored the unnatural order of the supernatural presence that had stalked the farm. By the time the sun rose, Hinterkaifeck was silent. The snow outside had muffled all sound, but it bore witness. Footprints of unnatural proportions twisted through the fields, some human, some unidentifiable, leading to the barn and fading into nothing. Even the livestock remained alive, as though the world outside had continued normally while the house itself had become a tomb. When authorities arrived days later, they were confronted with a scene that defied comprehension. Meals remained uneaten, a fire still smoldered, animals wandered freely, and no valuables had been taken. Footprints suggested multiple presences, some impossibly large or distorted. The murders were brutal yet purposeful. Every movement, every blow, hinted at a pattern beyond human reasoning. No perpetrator was ever found. Villagers whispered that it was impossible to commit such a crime alone, that the killer had been guided by forces unseen. Paranormal speculation emerged alongside historical fact. Possession, curses, restless spirits, all whispered as possible explanations. Hinterkaifeck became a legend, a grim example of the intersection of human horror and something darker, more eternal. Over the years, those brave or foolish enough to venture near the farm reported encounters that defied logic. Doors would open by themselves. Footsteps echoed in empty rooms. Whispering voices murmured unintelligible warnings. Shadows moved independently of any light source, and strange cold spots could freeze the breath in the lungs of visitors. Paranormal investigators captured fleeting orbs of light hovering near the barn, ghostly shapes in windows, and audio anomalies resembling the voices of the Gruber family pleading for mercy. Some locals swore that the spirits of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and the children remained, trapped between life and death, wandering the halls of the house and the grounds beyond. Others believed the killer's malevolent spirit lingered, bound to the site by the horrors he had committed, forever stalking the fields, patient and eternal, watching any who dared come near. Hinterkaifeck stands empty, yet alive in a way that is difficult to explain. The snow may fall, the wind may howl, and the forest may sway, but within the house, the echoes of March 31st, 1922 persist. Visitors feel oppressive dread, an unnatural weight pressing on the chest, a sensation of being watched by something beyond human perception. Those who step too close report hearing the scrape of a mattock against wood, whispering voices and shadows that defy logic. The story of Hinterkaifeck is more than history. It is a warning. Some evil does not die. It waits, it observes. It lingers in the shadows, patient, eternal, a reminder that even ordinary lives, farming families in a remote corner of Bavaria, can be obliterated by forces beyond comprehension. And the land remembers, the house remembers. The whispers never end.